3 in the morning, the 17th of October, and Maren Cole was driving Route 138 the way she did one night a year. Every year, on this exact night, the coast road was empty. Fog crawled up off the salt water. She had just come off a 14-hour shift in the emergency room, and there was still somebody else's blood on her sleeve. Then she saw the fire. A silver SUV lay on its side in the ditch, one wheel still turning slowly in the air, smoke pouring up thick and black. Maren hit the brakes, pulled the rescue hammer from her trunk, and was down the embankment before she had time to think about what she was doing. Wet grass slid under her shoes. The heat hit her face like a hand. Inside, a man was slumped over the wheel, his face streaked with blood and soot. She broke the window, reached through, and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Thump, thump, faint. But there. She got him out and had dragged him 15 steps when the fuel tank went. The blast knocked her flat on her face. Her shoulder hit stone. Debris came down around them in a hard rain. It was only after her ears stopped ringing, only when she knelt and lifted his shirt to stop the bleeding, that she found the thing that should not have been there. Not a crash wound. A small round hole, clean, straight through his ribs. 10 years in emergency medicine, Maren knew exactly what she was looking at. Somebody had shot this man before his car ever left the road. Her hand shook over the phone screen. 9-1. Her thumb hovered over the last number, and that was when the man opened his eyes. He didn't say a word. He simply closed his hand around her wrist and shook his head. Maren Cole never pressed that number. It would take her 7 weeks to understand why. On the very stretch of road where her sister had died, she was the one who happened to be there. If Maren and August's story reached you, even a little, leave a like so we know you stayed with us to the very end. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it too. And subscribe, so you don't miss the next story we're getting ready for you. She dragged him into her car with a strength she would never later be able to explain, his head lolling to one side across the back seat, and she drove away while the flames in the ditch still burned behind her. Not to the second-floor apartment above the laundromat. There were neighbors there, an elderly woman in the room next door who always woke at 4 o'clock, and a wooden staircase that groaned and cracked beneath every footstep. She turned left at the intersection at the end of the road, drove another 2.5 miles inland, and stopped in front of a low, single-story building with a faded sign that read Kettleman Veterinary Clinic. Her friend had closed the place in the spring, moved to another state, and still hadn't taken the key back from her. There were no cameras. She knew that for certain, because she had once sat in this very waiting room and listened to her friend complain that installing cameras cost too much money when no one would ever bother stealing a few cats. She unlocked the door with a hand still smeared with blood, dragged him across the threshold, and laid him on the stainless steel table in the middle of the room, a table made to hold a large dog, and roughly 2 handspans shorter than his body. She switched on the surgical lamp. White light poured down, and for the first time that night, she saw clearly what she was facing. Then she stopped thinking. She worked. She cut away his clothes, pressed gauze to the wound, pushed down hard where blood was still seeping from his side, silently counted to 60, then lifted her hand to see whether it was still bleeding. It was. She pressed down again. She pulled everything useful from the glass cabinet. Saline solution, local anesthetic intended for animals, the dosage of which she recalculated 3 times in her head before she dared draw it into a syringe. Sutures, a needle holder, gauze, bandages, alcohol. She cleaned the wound. She checked his back for the bullet's exit wound and found it there, smaller and cleaner, and she let out a long breath because it meant she wouldn't have to search his body for a piece of metal that night. She stitched him, 1 suture at a time, her left hand holding the edges of the skin together, her right hand turning the needle, tying each knot in the method she had taught herself at 22, when a physician on the night shift had shown her while they waited for surgery, the same knot she had used for 10 years and had never seen anyone else use. He groaned when the needle passed through his skin for the 4th time. She stopped, waited, then continued. The gash on his thigh took longer because it was filthy, packed with dirt and torn fibers, and she had to rinse it again and again until the water ran clear. As she pulled the soaked coat from his shoulders, something heavy slipped from the lining and struck the tiled floor with a dry metallic crack. She looked down. A black handgun with a textured grip lay on its side beneath the operating table. She stood motionless for the length of 3 breaths. Then she bent down, picked it up with 2 fingers as though it were a used scalpel, removed the magazine, pulled back the slide so the final round sprang free and rolled across the floor, retrieved that as well, and placed everything in the lowest drawer of the instrument cabinet, beneath heavy rolls of cotton and unused restraints. She closed it. Then she returned to the operating table and finished the stitch she had left incomplete because blood waited for no one. She hung the saline bag from a hook meant for dog leashes. She placed 2 fingers against his neck again, counted, and wrote the number on the back of a feline laboratory report. She checked again 15 minutes later, then another 15 minutes after that. Outside, the darkness began to thin into gray. By the time she finally secured the last bandage and pulled a wool blanket over him, the clock on the wall showed nearly 6 o'clock. She brought in the orange plastic chair from the waiting room, placed it beside the table, and sat down. Her hands rested in her lap. They were trembling, not from the cold, she realized, but in the same way they always trembled after a critical patient had survived, and her body was finally permitted to understand that she had been afraid. She stared down at them for a long time. 10 years she had done this work. 10 years of documenting every detail according to procedure, calling the correct number, transferring each patient to the proper facility, signing her name at the bottom of every form. Tonight, she had removed a man with a bullet wound from the scene, hidden him inside a clinic that wasn't hers, operated on him with medicine meant for animals, and placed his gun in a drawer. She hadn't called anyone. She hadn't reported anything. And what frightened her most, as she sat on that orange plastic chair beneath the slowly rising light, wasn't that she had done something wrong. It was that throughout those critical hours, not once had she believed she was wrong. She dozed for perhaps 40 minutes in that plastic chair, her head tilted to one side, and woke to the sound of birds beyond the window rather than to any noise inside the room. The first light of morning had slipped through a gap in the curtains, laying a pale golden streak across the wool blanket. The man still lay exactly as she had left him. She rose, walked over, placed 2 fingers against his neck out of habit, counted, and wrote the number on the scrap of paper that was already half covered with notes. Better. Not much better, but better. Then she did what she hadn't had time to do all night. She filled a basin with warm water, took a clean cloth, and began to wash him. Dried blood clung to his skin in dark patches, along his neck, across his shoulders, down both sides of his ribs. And she wiped it away little by little as she had done for hundreds of people before him, without hurrying, without thinking, simply completing a task that needed to be done, until the cloth passed over the lower right side of his abdomen, and she stopped. There, beneath the blood she had just cleaned away, was an old surgical scar. About 4 knuckles long, faded to silver, fully healed for many years, and along that scar remained the marks of sutures. She bent closer. Then she reached over and switched on the surgical lamp again, even though daylight had already come. White light poured down, and she saw it clearly. The knotting pattern, it wasn't the kind they taught in school. It wasn't the kind used by any doctor in the department where she had worked. It was the method she had taught herself at 22 from a physician on the night shift who had since retired and moved to Florida. The method she had altered again and again until it fit naturally in her hands. The method Hallie Pike had once teased her for calling her signature. She straightened. Her heart was beating faster than it needed to. She studied the man's face, still pale and streaked with soot, one eyebrow split by another old scar, and searched her memory for something. Anything. Nothing came. In 10 years in the emergency room, how many people had she stitched? 2,000. 3,000. Their faces had flowed past her like water. She couldn't possibly remember them all. She told herself the sutures might be a coincidence, that somewhere in the world there had to be someone else who tied knots the same way, that she was exhausted and seeing only what she wanted to see. But she didn't believe herself. A nurse was trained to note an abnormal sign without rushing to a conclusion, and that was exactly what she did. Beneath the row of pulse readings, she wrote one brief line on the scrap of paper. Old surgical scar, lower right abdomen, familiar suture pattern. Then she folded the paper and slipped it into her pants pocket. She turned toward the coat draped over the back of the chair, the one she had stripped from him at midnight and hadn't bothered to touch since the gun had fallen out. It was heavy, wet, and made from a fabric she knew she could never afford. She searched the inside pockets. No wallet, no driver's license, no insurance card, not a single piece of paper bearing a name. People didn't travel the road at 3 o'clock in the morning carrying nothing at all unless they had meant to. In the left pocket, she found 2 things. The first was a heavy white gold ring, its face engraved with an old-fashioned letter V, the strokes thick and sharp. It felt cold in her palm. The second was a key, also heavy, longer than an ordinary house key, with a number stamped into its head that she had to tilt toward the light before she could read it. 37. No keychain, no label, nothing else. She placed both objects on the stainless steel table and stared at them. A man driving an expensive car, wearing expensive clothes, carrying no identification whatsoever, with a loaded gun hidden on his body, and a bullet wound passing through his side. She had known all of this from the moment she knelt in the wet grass beside Route 138. But knowing something in panic was different from knowing it in daylight. After the bleeding had stopped, and her hands had nothing left to do, she thought of the phone in her pocket. She thought of 3 numbers. She thought that there was still time, that she could say she had been afraid, that she had panicked, that she hadn't been able to think clearly, and perhaps they would believe her. Then she looked toward the operating table, where a man was breathing steadily beneath a wool blanket because she had spent 4 hours sitting beside him, and she understood that she wasn't going to call. She picked up the ring, returned it to the coat pocket, and went to wash her hands. Behind her, on the stainless steel table, the man moved for the first time since midnight. She turned off the faucet and looked back to find his hand moving along the edge of the stainless steel table, slowly, blindly, searching for something. She knew at once what he was looking for. That hand slid toward his hip, where a holster should have been, found nothing, then reached toward the coat, draped over the back of the chair, and stopped halfway, because his body wouldn't allow him to go any farther. He opened his eyes. They were dark, and far more alert than the eyes of a man who had lost that much blood had any right to be, and they swept across the entire room in less than 2 seconds. The door, the window, the glass cabinet, before settling on her face. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but it didn't tremble. It wasn't the question of a frightened man. It was the question of someone deciding what kind of person she was. Maren stepped closer, though not too close. "I'm the person who pulled you out of that car," she said. "You were shot in the side. The bullet passed through, and didn't remain inside. You also had a deep laceration in your thigh, and I stitched both wounds. You lost a great deal of blood. Your heart is beating faster than I'd like." He listened to every word. Then he spoke his second sentence. "No hospital." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an explanation. 2 words placed between them like a heavy object set down upon a table, with the silent understanding that everything afterward would be arranged around it. He didn't ask whether she had called anyone. He didn't thank her. Maren became aware of that with a sharp, cold clarity, and something inside her hardened. Then he planted one elbow against the table and tried to sit up. She placed her palm in the center of his chest and pushed him back down. "No," she said. One word. He looked up at her, and for an instant something crossed his face that she couldn't read, like a man hearing a sound he hadn't heard in a very long time. "It took me 4 hours to stitch you back together," she continued, her voice even, the same voice she used with drunk patients who demanded to pull out their intravenous lines at 2 o'clock in the morning. "If you sit up now, the stitches in your side will tear open, and I'll have to start all over with whatever anesthetic is left in that cabinet. And I'm telling you now, there isn't much. Lie down." He didn't lie down immediately. He held himself in that half-raised position for several more seconds, and she saw the muscles in his neck tighten with the effort, saw sweat gathering at his temple, and saw him weighing whether he should push her hand away. Then the blood remaining in his body made the decision for him. His face turned gray, his elbow gave way, and he sank back onto the table with a breath leaving his lungs. He yielded, but she knew perfectly well it wasn't because she had been right. She pulled the blanket higher and adjusted the saline bag on the hook. As she reached above her, a strand of hair slipped free from her bun and fell across her face. She brushed it back and pinned it into place again beside her left ear, where she had always secured it for the past 10 years, because she needed to tilt her head to the right when listening through a stethoscope. He watched her do it. He watched longer than necessary, long enough that she felt it and looked down at him. Then he spoke slowly, one word at a time, as though even he was astonished by what he was about to say. "You still pin your hair on the left." Maren froze. Her hand was still raised near the hook, and she forgot to lower it. The room became so quiet that she could hear the saline dripping. "What did you say?" she asked, though she had heard him perfectly. He didn't repeat it. He only looked at her, and the assessment that had been in his eyes moments earlier was gone. In its place was something deeply weary, something old and private, the kind of thing a person revealed only before someone they had known before. Then her memory opened like a door pushed wide by the wind. 4 years earlier, September. An ordinary Tuesday night. A man had been brought in close to midnight by 2 friends who refused to give their names, with a wound in the lower right side of his abdomen. No identification, no insurance, and no one calling the police even though someone should have. The physician on duty that night had been occupied with a multiple vehicle collision on Route 10, and she had been the one who stitched him. She remembered bending over him for a long time because the lighting in room 3 had been poor. She remembered tying the knots in her own particular way. She remembered arriving for her shift the following morning to find bed 7 empty, the sheets neatly folded, and no one ever mentioning it again, because in an emergency room, no one had time to ask questions like that. She lowered her hand. "It was you," she said. As he closed his eyes, and one corner of his mouth lifted by perhaps a single millimeter, the closest thing to a smile his body still had the strength to make. "I recognized you," he said, "the moment I opened my eyes in that roadside ditch." He asked for his phone, which she had found in his pants pocket before dawn, and placed on the table beside the ring. A diagonal crack ran across the screen, but it still lit up. He dialed a single number and spoke exactly 3 sentences, one giving the name of the road, one giving the name Kettleman Veterinary Clinic, and one she couldn't hear clearly, then let his hand fall and closed his eyes, as though those 3 sentences had taken the last of his strength. "How long?" she asked. 20 minutes, he said. In reality, it was 17. She counted because she always counted. The vehicle parked outside kept its engine running, and 2 sets of footsteps crossed the gravel, one heavy and one light, reaching the door at the same time. The door opened without anyone knocking. The man who entered first was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with large hands covered in old burn scars, the kind carried by someone who had spent many years working with heated metal. The person behind him was a woman, smaller, with hair cut close at the nape of her neck, and the gun in her hand was already raised before the door had fully opened. The barrel stopped at the center of Marin's chest. "Step away from him," the woman said. Marin didn't move. She was standing between the operating table and the door, one hand still holding the intravenous line, and the first thing she thought about wasn't the gun but the saline bag that would slip free if she let go. "If I step away, the line will fail," she said. Her voice sounded strange even to her, too calm, too much like the voice she used when telling a patient's family member to sit down. "I just spent 4 hours keeping him alive. If you shoot me now, I'll fall. The needle will come out, and you'll have to stop his bleeding yourself on the way back." The woman didn't lower the gun, but her finger moved away from the trigger and rested along the frame, and Marin knew enough about people who carried weapons to understand what that meant. The older man stepped forward, extended one scarred and calloused hand, and slowly pressed the barrel downward, without struggling, as though brushing a branch out of his path. "Teddy," he said, only one word. Then he walked around Marin to the operating table, bent down to look at the man lying there, and Marin saw his shoulders drop by perhaps half an inch. "Boss," he said. The man on the table opened his eyes. Rufus. The woman named Teddy still hadn't put away her gun. She walked around the room, opened the glass cabinet, looked into the basin of murky water, studied the pile of soiled gauze in the bucket, examined Marin's scrap of paper covered with numbers on the table, and finally stopped in front of the lowest drawer of the instrument cabinet. She pulled it open. The handgun lay inside beside its magazine and one loose round. Teddy turned around, and once again the barrel rose. "You unloaded this," she said. "I unload anything that might accidentally fire in a room with an unconscious patient," Marin said. "I also put away the scissors and scalpels. Would you like to check the upper drawer?" Teddy took one step forward, and the man on the table spoke. Enough. Only one word, rough and barely audible. But it fell into the room, and both of them became still. Teddy lowered the gun and returned it to its holster. Rufus didn't look at her. He simply opened the rear door of the vehicle, and then the two of them removed a flat board from inside and began moving the man from the table. Marin held the intravenous line and followed every step, and all 3 times she said, "Slow down." They slowed down. Outside in the yard, the gray van had no windows in the rear compartment. A radio had been left on in the front seat, and while they were securing the board, a man's voice came through the static. brief and clear. "Mr. Varnado has been found. Bringing him back now." Then the static swallowed the rest. Marin stood motionless with the intravenous line in her hand. Varnado. She had read that name in the local newspaper 3 times over the past 10 years. Each time on a page featuring a photograph of a building or a harbor, each time accompanied by the phrase "insufficient grounds for prosecution." She had heard it spoken quietly in the nurse's break room after a shift when 3 men had arrived with gunshot wounds on the same night. She had heard it from the mouth of a patrol officer smoking outside the emergency department, telling his partner that some names were best left out of official reports. Rufus and Teddy were occupied with the straps. Her car keys were still in her pants pocket. Her car was parked about 10 steps away, its front facing the main road, and neither of them was watching her. She had 3 seconds. She counted them as they passed. 1, 2, 3, as calmly as she would count a pulse. Then she stepped onto the van's running board, lowered her head as she entered the rear compartment, and sat beside the board, her hand still holding the saline bag high above him. Rufus looked up at her. "You know who we are now, don't you?" he said. "I know my stitches," Marin replied, "and I haven't transferred my patient into anyone else's care." The van had been moving for about 10 minutes when it stopped in an empty parking lot outside a building supply store that hadn't yet opened, where another vehicle was already waiting. The man who crossed over was around 60, with short silver hair and a leather bag whose handle had been worn smooth with age. He climbed into the rear compartment, closed the door behind him, and greeted no one. "Whitcomb," Rufus called from the front seat. "I know," the old man replied. He sat opposite Marin, switched on the small light fixed to the van's ceiling, and pulled the blanket away from August's leg. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask who had done the work. He simply looked. He examined the stitches in August's side first, then those in his thigh, studying them for quite some time, leaning close beneath the yellow light, and Marin watched his finger trace the line of sutures without touching them. Then he raised his head and gave a single nod. "Just one." He said nothing. During the 7 weeks that followed, it would be the only praise she received from anyone in that house, and she would remember it for a very long time. "There's a fragment still inside," he continued, his voice dry, as though he were reading a line from a medical chart. "In the thigh. You cleaned the wound, but you didn't see it because it's buried deep beneath the muscle. It wasn't your fault. Without imaging equipment, no one would have seen it." Marin looked down. "Metal or fabric?" "Metal. It broke off when the bullet struck the bone." He opened the leather bag and removed a long pair of forceps, a small glass vial, and a roll of gauze. "The van can't stop. We'll do it here." "Do you have anything for the pain?" "Yes. Not much." He drew the medication into a syringe, measuring the dose by sight, and Marin noticed that his hands were perfectly steady, steadier than hers had been before dawn. He injected the anesthetic around the edges of the wound, waited about 2 minutes, then cut through the outermost stitches she had placed with one clean snip of his scissors. "Sorry about undoing your work," he said. "Just do what you need to do," Marin replied. She moved to sit near August's head, her left hand still holding the saline bag high above him, her right resting on his shoulder to keep him from sliding with the motion of the van. He had remained conscious ever since they placed him inside, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling of the compartment, without speaking a single word. When the forceps entered the wound for the first time, his entire body went rigid. His hand slid across the board, searching for something to hold, and found Marin's wrist. He squeezed. She didn't pull away. It was a professional reflex, before it was anything else. The instinct 10 years in an emergency room had taught her that when someone was in pain, it was better to give them something to grip than to let them bite through their own tongue. She turned her hand and pressed her palm against his. "Squeeze as hard as you need to," she said close to his ear, her voice even. "Count with me. 1, 2, 3. He didn't count with her, but he didn't make a sound either. No groan, no gasp, not a single noise except for the slow breath he drew through clenched teeth. The van struck a pothole, and Whitcomb muttered a quiet curse. Sweat ran in a thin stream down August's temple. His fingers tightened until Marin felt the blood leave her fingertips, numbness rising toward her elbow, and when she looked down, she saw that her skin had turned purple beneath his grip. She still didn't pull away. "All right," Whitcomb said after roughly 3 minutes that felt like 30. He dropped a metal fragment no larger than half a grain of rice into the glass vial, and the faint sound it made against the glass seemed startlingly clear inside the van. "Only one fragment. Lucky." August's hand loosened. He didn't release her completely. The old man flushed the wound again, replaced the 3 stitches he had removed, and worked twice as fast as she had. Then he sat upright, wiped his hands, and looked fully at Marin for the first time. "Where do you work?" "St. Bridget Hospital, emergency department. Night shift? For 10 years. He nodded again, returned the forceps to his bag, and asked nothing more. The van continued onward. Marin couldn't see the road because the rear compartment had no windows, but she could feel it. The short turns of the city became less frequent, then disappeared entirely. The sound of the pavement changed beneath the tires, and after about half an hour, something else slipped through the seams of the doors. A smell she had known since childhood, the scent of salt mud and dried seaweed at low tide. They were driving toward the ocean, away from the city, beyond the reach of everything she knew. She sat in the dark compartment with a saline bag in her left hand and the hand of a man named Varnado in her right, her fingers still numb, and thought about her shift that evening, about her car left behind in the yard of an abandoned veterinary clinic, about the 3 numbers she hadn't dialed. There had been no single moment when she could still have turned back. That moment had passed somewhere between Route 138 and the stainless steel table, and she hadn't seen it go. They carried August upstairs by way of a broad staircase she didn't have time to study, and when she tried to follow, Teddy blocked her path with one arm. "Dr. Whitcomb will handle that part. You're coming with me." The kitchen stood at the end of the ground floor hallway, long and paved with gray stone, with a thick wooden table large enough to seat 10 people, though only 2 were there now. Teddy pointed to a chair. Marin sat down. No one offered her water. "Name." "Marin Cole." "What were you doing on Route 138 at 3 o'clock in the morning?" "Driving home." "Where do you live?" "Providence, Wickenden Street." Teddy leaned against the edge of the sink, her arms folded across her chest. "There are 4 ways to get from St. Bridget to Wickenden Street. None of them goes through Route 138. That road adds another 23 minutes and leads nowhere except a few boatyards that have been closed since September. You seem to know the way to my home better than I do. That's my job. Answer the question." Marin looked down at her hands resting on the wooden table. Black grime still rimmed her fingernails. There was a streak of dried blood on her cuff. Not August's blood, but the blood of a 64-year-old man who had suffered a heart attack, been brought in at 10 o'clock that night, and died at 11:20. A man whose chest she had compressed for 20 minutes, and still hadn't been able to save. "I took that road because I wanted to," she said. "Not enough. It has to be enough." "No." Teddy pushed away from the sink and stepped toward her. "A man is shot on a stretch of road where almost no one travels at night. Less than 10 minutes later, a nurse appears. At exactly the right time, in exactly the right place. She has an emergency hammer in her trunk. She has a suture kit. She has the key to a clinic without cameras 2.5 miles away. You expect me to believe that was a coincidence?" And that was when Marin became angry. She sprang to her feet, sending the chair scraping backward across the stone floor. "I keep an emergency hammer in my trunk because I've spent 10 years pulling people out of crushed cars, and I'm sick of standing there waiting for a rescue crew. I carry a suture kit because I bought it with my own money after the night a boy bled on the side of the road, while all I had were my bare hands. I have the key to that clinic because my friend moved away and forgot to ask for it back." She raised her stained cuff. "And this is the blood of an old man named Peterson. I performed chest compressions on him for 20 minutes. I had just finished a 14-hour shift. I hadn't eaten anything since noon yesterday. I was driving home, and I saw the fire, and I did exactly what I always do. And now I'm sitting in the kitchen of a man I don't know, listening to you ask why I saved someone's life." Her voice broke on the final word. She stopped, drew in a breath, and sat down. She didn't tell her about Junie. She had almost said it. She had felt it rising all the way into her throat. That date, that stretch of road, the real reason she drove through there once every year. But she swallowed it because she looked into the woman's eyes and knew that if she brought Junie into the room, Junie would become another object laid upon the table, and Marin hadn't been able to keep her sister alive. But at the very least, she could protect her name. Teddy watched her for a long time. Then she held out her hand. "Phone." "What are you going to do with it?" "Check it. Hand it over." Marin gave it to her. Teddy connected it to a small black device attached to a laptop at the head of the table, typed several lines, and sat down. The refrigerator was the only sound left in the kitchen. Marin remained still, her hands folded in her lap, counting her own pulse because she didn't know what else to do. She had counted into the 400s when Teddy stopped typing. The woman said nothing. She stared at the screen. Then she scrolled down slowly, scrolled back up again, and straightened in her chair, and Marin recognized something 10 years in an emergency room had taught her to read very well, the precise moment when someone had just seen something they had never been prepared to see. "What is it?" Marin asked. Teddy didn't answer. She disconnected the phone from the device, stood, walked to the doorway, and called down the hall. "Rufus." He entered in less than 10 seconds, still holding a cup of coffee. Teddy turned the laptop screen toward him and pointed to a single line. Rufus set the cup on the table without looking at it, and the coffee tipped, spilling a brown streak across the wood that neither of them noticed. He leaned down to read. He read longer than Teddy had. Then he raised his eyes to Marin, and the look he gave her was entirely different from the one he had given her inside the van. There was no suspicion left in it, only something close to pity, and that frightened her more than the gun had that morning. "What did you find on my phone?" she asked. "Stay here," Rufus said. He picked up the laptop and walked out. Teddy slipped Marin's phone into her jacket pocket and followed him. The kitchen door closed behind them. Neither of them offered a single word of explanation. She sat alone in the kitchen for nearly an hour, and no one returned to explain anything. When the door finally opened, Rufus was the one who came in, and he said only that Mr. Varnado wanted to see her. The bedroom was on the second floor at the end of the hallway, its windows overlooking the bay. August had been moved from the board to the bed, his body cleaned, his bandages replaced, another bag of saline hanging from a proper metal stand instead of a hook meant for dog leashes. Whitcomb was packing his leather bag and leaving as she entered, giving her his second nod of the day. August waited until the door had closed completely. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair beside the bed. "You want to go home?" he said. It wasn't a question. "My shift starts at 7 o'clock tonight. You're not going to work tonight. You're not going back to your apartment on Wickenden Street either." Marin started to speak, but he lifted one hand a few inches, just enough to stop her. "The person who shot me last night wasn't alone. There were at least 2 vehicles. When I drove into the ditch, they stopped above to confirm it. That's procedure. They always confirm. Then they saw your headlights approaching from a distance and pulled away, but they stopped long enough." He looked at her. "They have your license plate. With the plate, they have your name, your address, your work schedule. If I had died last night, you wouldn't matter. Because I'm still alive, you're the only person who saw the scene, and the only person who knows where I've been for the past 6 hours." He spoke slowly, placing no emphasis anywhere, like a man reading laboratory results. "If you go back to Wickenden Street tonight, someone will be waiting for you there. Maybe not tonight, maybe the day after tomorrow, but someone will come." Marin remained silent. She thought of the wooden staircase that groaned beneath every step, of the elderly woman next door who woke at 4 o'clock, of the wilted basil plant on her windowsill that she had forgotten to water for 3 days. "What about the hospital?" she asked. "Even less," she argued with him. She argued for 15 minutes, saying she had patience, that the department was understaffed, that Hallie Pike had already covered 2 of her shifts that week, that if she disappeared without an explanation, someone would call the police, and that would be even more dangerous for him. The final point was the only one he acknowledged. "Then you need an explanation," he said. "Call them. Say you're sick." He handed her his own phone, the one with the diagonal crack across the screen. She knew Hallie's number by heart. It rang twice. "Hello? Hallie, it's Marin." "Oh, strange number. Did you lose your phone?" And Marin heard her own voice rise calmly, slightly hoarse, saying that she had come down with the flu during the night, that she had a fever and couldn't get out of bed, that she needed 3 days off, that she was sorry for calling so late, and asking Hallie to tell the head nurse for her. She heard herself say every word clearly. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't stumble. The lie flowed from her as smoothly as though she had rehearsed it, and that was what sent a chill down her spine. In 10 years of doing this work, she had never lied once, not because she was noble, but because there was no room for lies in an emergency department. One false sentence could become the wrong dose of medicine, and yet it had come so easily. "Drink plenty of water," Hallie said. "I'll cover your shift. Get some rest." "Thank you." She ended the call and stared at the cracked screen for a while. August said nothing. He only watched her, and she had the feeling that he knew exactly what had just happened inside her. The older woman knocked on the door half an hour later, carrying a stack of neatly folded clothes. She introduced herself as Priscilla, August's aunt, and the way she entered the room made it clear that she was the only person in that house who didn't need to knock and still chose to do so. She led Maren to another room on the same floor, opened the wardrobe, placed the stack of clothes on the bed, and began folding each piece again, even though they were already perfectly flat. "These will probably be a little large," she said. "My former daughter-in-law left them behind. You can use them. Thank you. You saved him." She didn't look up. Her hand smoothed a crease in the collar of a shirt, then smoothed it again and again. 7 years ago, his older brother had no one to save him. They sent him back to this house in a wooden box and left it outside the gate at 5 o'clock in the morning. I was the one who opened the gate. Maren didn't know what to say. Priscilla placed the final shirt on top of the stack, patted it twice, then turned around, and the smile had returned to her face, gentle and warm, as though the words she had just spoken had never been said. "The bathroom is across the hall. It takes a little while for the hot water to come through. Would you like eggs or porridge?" "Probably porridge. You look as though you haven't eaten in days." She slept for 4 hours in the room with the window overlooking the bay and woke before dawn. In that bewildering moment, every night shift worker knew, when the body could no longer tell morning from evening. She lay still and listened. The house made no sound at all. No wooden staircase creaking. No washing machines running downstairs. No elderly neighbor switching on her kettle at 4 o'clock. It was that silence that made her sit upright. She put her own clothes back on, the ones someone had washed, folded, and left on the chair. The bloodstain on the cuff was gone, and she stared at the place where it had once been for longer than necessary. Then she placed her few belongings into the cloth bag Priscilla had given her, went downstairs, and walked toward the front door. No one stopped her in the hallway. No one stopped her in the entrance hall. The front door wasn't locked. She stepped outside, and the cold salt air struck her face. And for the first 30 seconds, she truly believed she would be able to leave. The driveway was a gravel road roughly 200 paces long, lined on both sides by low trees that the ocean wind had bent entirely in one direction. An iron gate stood at the end. 2 men were stationed there, one young and one middle-aged, both wearing black coats, and both had seen her when she was still about 50 paces away. Neither of them approached. Neither reached inside his coat. The younger one even nodded in greeting. "Good morning, ma'am." "I want to go outside," Maren said. "Yes, ma'am." He said nothing more. He didn't say no. He didn't offer a reason. He simply stood there with his arms resting at his sides, while the gate behind him remained closed. She walked right up to it. She examined the latch. There was no visible lock, which meant it was controlled from somewhere else. She placed her hand on the iron bar, and the cold bit into her skin. "Open it for me." "I can't open it, ma'am." "You can't open it, or you're not allowed to open it?" The younger man glanced at the older one. The older man looked out toward the road. Neither answered, and Maren understood that their silence was the answer. She stood there. She didn't shout. She didn't shake the gate. 10 years in an emergency room had taught her that the person who lost control was the person who lost the right to be heard, and that right was the only thing she still possessed. So she remained there, her hand resting on the cold iron bar, looking out at the road beyond it, an empty road following the edge of the water, with mist still lying low over the bay, and somewhere far to the north was the city where her apartment waited, where her basil plant had died from lack of water, where the drawer beside her bed held a photograph she couldn't bear to leave in sight. She didn't know how long she stood there. Long enough for the eastern sky to change from gray to a paler gray. Long enough for the 2 guards to shift their weight several times. Then, gravel crunched behind her, and Teddy approached wearing a thin coat, her hair still wet, holding a cup of coffee she didn't offer to share. She stopped about 3 paces from Maren and looked out at the road as well. "Were you planning to walk?" Teddy asked. "If I have to. The nearest bus stop is about 7 miles from here. I know how to walk." Teddy took a sip. "All right. Suppose I open the gate." She turned and looked directly at Maren, and there was no hostility in her voice, which somehow made it worse. "You reach the main road. Then what? You go back to the apartment where someone may be waiting for you. You can't go there. You go to the hospital after calling to say you were bedridden with a fever. How are you going to explain that? You call the police. They ask where you were on October 17th. You tell them everything, and within 4 hours, your name is sitting on the desks of 3 different people. She paused. Or perhaps you go to your parents' house, your best friend's house, your husband's house. What exactly are you going out there to do? Is there anyone out there waiting for you? Marin opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She thought of Hallie Pike, who would be working the morning shift, and would panic and call someone, which meant that wasn't possible. She thought of the foster home in Pawtucket, where she had lived from the age of 9 until 18, and the kind woman who had run it, who had been dead for many years. She thought of the man she had once called her husband, whom she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. She thought of Junie, and that was where her thoughts stopped and couldn't go any farther. There was no one. There had been no one for 4 years. She simply had never been forced to say it aloud. Teddy watched her for a moment, then turned away. Priscilla made oatmeal. You should eat. Marin remained there a little longer with her hand against the cold iron bar. Then she lifted her bag and walked back along the gravel road toward the house. And she understood with perfect clarity that the gate hadn't imprisoned her at all. It had merely shown her something she had spent 4 years arranging her life very carefully, so she would never have to see. While Marin ate oatmeal in the kitchen, Rufus Brannock sat in the small room behind the library with 3 stacks of printed pages and Teddy's laptop. He didn't believe in instinct. He believed in records, and Marin Cole's record was thin enough to be suspicious. Born in Woonsocket. Mother died when she was 9. Placed in foster care in Pawtucket with her younger sister. Nursing degree at 21. St. Bridget ever since. 1 marriage, 1 divorce, no dispute over property, because there had been no property to dispute. No significant debt beyond a student loan that was nearly paid off. No criminal record. No connections worth noting. Rufus turned to the final page, the death certificate of her younger sister, and was about to fold the entire file closed when his eyes stopped on one line. Junie Cole, 24 years old, killed in a traffic accident on Route 138 on the night of October 17th, 4 years earlier. Rufus sat perfectly still. Then he returned to the first page and began reading the file in a different way. The scene report described a freight truck, a driver who fled, and the vehicle being found 2 days later in a scrapyard across the state line, burned to its frame. No one was ever arrested. The case was closed after 11 months when every lead had run out. Rufus entered the truck's license plate into the computer. It had been registered to a transportation company with an office in Fall River, a bland 3-word name, the kind created so no one would remember it. He searched further. The company had closed 14 months after the crash. The owner named in the records was a 73-year-old man living in a nursing home who had never driven a truck in his life. Rufus didn't need to investigate the parent company behind it. He had seen that name on cargo manifests at the harbor for 7 years. It belonged to Yevgeny Orlik. He rested one hand on the desk and remained there for another moment. Then he called Teddy and told her to obtain Junie Cole's old employment records by any means necessary. It took another 2 hours. Junie Cole had once worked as an accountant for a small shipping company that handled partial cargo loads at the Port of Providence, a company that had been acquired 3 years later, and the buyer had been Orlik. Among the documents Teddy recovered from an electronic archive maintained by the state tax department was an internal whistleblower report. The sender had used her real name rather than filing anonymously. Junie Cole. The report consisted of 3 pages listing shipments declared as one thing and received as another, complete with bill of lading numbers. It had been submitted on October 14th, 3 days before she died. Rufus printed everything, clipped the pages together, and went upstairs. August was sitting propped against the pillows, his face still gray but his eyes fully alert. Rufus placed the file on the blanket and remained standing while he read. August read slowly. He reached the final page, then turned back to the beginning and read the date again. Beyond the window, the tide was rising. Last night was the anniversary of her death, Rufus said. Exactly 4 years. She drove through there because she was visiting her sister. That's why she was on Route 138 at 3 o'clock in the morning. August said nothing. And it wasn't an accident, Rufus continued. The younger woman sent that report to the tax department on the 14th. 3 days later, there was a truck waiting on an empty road. That truck belonged to Orlik. I've watched him do the same thing to 3 other people over the past 7 years. August still said nothing. Rufus waited. Then he spoke the most difficult part. That woman needs to know. No. 1 word. Spoken so quietly that Rufus thought he had misheard him. Boss. Don't tell her anything yet. August closed the file, placed it beside his hip, and kept one hand resting over it. Not yet. She has driven along that road every year for 4 years. For 4 years, she has believed it was a hit-and-run accident. She has a right to know. I know she has a right. Then why? August remained silent for a long time, and when he finally answered, his voice was so even that Rufus had to study his face carefully to see what lay beneath it. Because if I give this to her this morning, she'll be standing at the gate by this afternoon demanding to leave, and this time she won't come back inside. She'll go looking for Orlick. She has no gun, no people, no idea where he is, and she'll be dead within 3 days. Or, Rufus said, she'll stay and help you finish him. Or that. August looked toward the window. I'm not gambling on it. Rufus straightened. He had served this family since August was a boy running through the welding shop, and he was one of only 2 people in the world who could speak plainly to him without losing anything for it. I've been here 19 years, he said. I've watched you give many difficult orders. I've never seen you give one because you were afraid. Are you finished? Yes. Then close the door behind you. Rufus left. He stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand still resting on the doorknob and listened to the rustle of paper inside as the man in the room opened the file and began reading it for the 3rd time. Downstairs in the kitchen, Maren Cole was washing her oatmeal bowl and placing it upside down on the rack to dry. That afternoon, Maren found the library in the eastern wing, a long room with 4 armchairs and a desktop computer sitting on a table in the corner, the kind of old machine people left there for guests to use even though no one ever truly used it. Priscilla passed by and told her she was welcome to use it, that the password was taped to the back of the monitor, and she said it so naturally that Maren believed no one considered her a threat of any kind. She sat down. For the first 30 seconds, she didn't know what she intended to do. Then her fingers typed a sequence of letters and numbers she didn't need to remember because she had never forgotten it, the license plate of the truck. It had been recorded in the scene report she had read until the corners of the pages tore during that first year, read so many times that the investigator assigned to the case finally told her that reading it again wouldn't help him find the driver any faster. For 4 years, that sequence had remained in her mind like the phone number of someone who had died, useless and impossible to erase. She searched through a public state vehicle registration database, the same one she had used 3 times during the first year before giving up, because it returned only a handful of meaningless lines. This time was no different. Vehicle type, year of manufacture, registration status canceled. And one line she had seen many times, but had never followed any farther. The name of the registered company. 3 bland words, the kind of name no one remembered. 4 years earlier, she had called the company's telephone number twice, and both times she had reached an automated answering system. 4 years earlier, she had been a 24-year-old nurse who had just lost her sister and didn't know whom to ask or what questions to ask them. Now she was sitting inside the home of a man whose identity was known throughout the entire state. She took a ballpoint pen from the drawer and copied the company's name onto her left palm because she didn't want to leave behind a piece of paper, and because for 10 years she had written everything important in the palm of her hand during a shift. Then she cleared the search history, shut down the computer, and sat for another moment staring at the black screen. She found Rufus on the back porch, unwinding a coil of rope from a post. She asked him directly, without circling around the subject, because she had decided that if she tried to be subtle, he would see through her. Do you know this company? She opened her palm. Rufus glanced down, and Maren saw it. Not in his expression, because his expression didn't change. It was in the timing. He answered before he had finished reading. An ordinary person looking at 3 unfamiliar words written on someone else's palm would need about 1 breath to read them, another breath to think, and only then would they speak. Rufus answered immediately. Never heard of it. Probably a small transportation company. There are dozens of names like that across the river. Brief, clean, complete, and far too fast. 10 years in an emergency room had taught Maren to read people the way physicians read medical scans, not by looking at what was there, but by noticing what was missing. People who lied about drinking alcohol answered too quickly. Family members who concealed a patient's fall told the story too neatly. The man standing before her had just done both. Did you even finish reading it before you answered? She asked. Rufus wound the last loop of rope and hung it on the post. You asked whether I recognized it. I don't. I asked whether you knew it. Same thing. He brushed his hands against his trouser legs. Anything you need to know, Ask him. Then he went back inside the house, walking slightly faster than necessary, and Maren remained alone on the porch with the sea wind blowing across her face. She closed her left hand into a fist. From that afternoon onward, Maren began doing the one thing she was better at than anyone else in that house, she observed. Not what people said, but the moments when they stopped speaking. At dinner, when she asked Teddy when she would get her phone back, Teddy looked toward Rufus before answering, and that glance lasted about a second and a half. When she asked Priscilla whether there was another road out of the area besides Route 138, the older woman was pouring tea, and though her hand didn't stop moving, her answer drifted toward the weather instead. When Maren went upstairs to change August's bandages that evening, and mentioned that she had spent the entire afternoon in the library, he asked what she had been reading, and she told him she had read a few books about maritime travel, and he nodded, and he didn't ask another question. He didn't ask anything else. That was what was wrong. This man had asked her the name of the physician on duty that night, asked where she had purchased her suture kit, asked whether she had eaten breakfast. This man asked about everything. Yet on the only afternoon she had sat in front of a computer, he asked nothing at all. That night, Maren lay in the room overlooking the bay and counted every silence from the day, arranging them beside one another like vital signs on a chart, and she realized that all of them pointed in the same direction. There was something inside this house that everyone knew. Everyone except her. The bandage change took place at 9 o'clock each evening, and by the second day, it had become a kind of ritual that neither of them named. She knocked. He told her to come in. She spread a clean towel over the small table beside the bed, opened a package of gauze, and he lifted his shirt without waiting for her to ask. On the first night, he said nothing. On the second night, while she was removing the bandage from his side, he asked, "You aren't afraid of blood?" "No." "Never?" "Of course I was. During my first year." She dipped the gauze into the solution and squeezed out the excess. "The first case I ever assisted with was a man who had been caught in a cutting machine at a lumber mill. I went into the hallway and threw up, then I went back inside. And after that I understood something." She cleaned around the edges of the stitches, slowly and evenly. "Blood isn't the problem. Blood is only what people can see. The problem is blood pressure, breathing, the clock ticking inside your head. When you have something to do, there's no empty space left in your mind for fear." She placed a fresh pad of gauze over the wound. "Anyone who does this work long enough becomes the same. We aren't braver than anyone else. We're simply busy." August was silent for a moment. "So that night in the ditch, you were only busy?" "Yes." "You're lying." She looked up. He was watching her, and there was no mockery in his gaze. "When people are busy, they save someone, call emergency services, and go home to sleep," he said. "They don't drive a stranger with a bullet hole in his body 2.5 miles to a veterinary clinic." She cut the medical tape, secured both ends, and didn't answer. The third night was the night he thanked her. He said it plainly, just as she finished applying the final dressing. Only 2 words, without ceremony. And Maren dropped the roll of tape. It rolled across the floor and stopped beside the bed. She bent to retrieve it, taking far longer than anyone needed to pick up a roll of tape. And when she stood again, her face had returned to normal, though the flush along her neck hadn't. "Why are you like that?" he asked. "Like what?" "Someone points a gun at you, and you stand there calmly talking. I thank you, and you start dropping things." She placed the unused gauze back inside the box. She arranged it very carefully, one piece at a time, even though it was only leftover gauze. "You need to rest," she said. "Maren." It was the first time he had spoken her name. She closed the box and didn't answer his question. Not that night, and not for many nights afterward. She was still cleaning up when someone knocked, and Teddy entered with Rufus. Maren started to leave, but August told her to stay. Teddy placed a cheap plastic phone and a printed screenshot on the blanket. "On the night of the 16th, at 11:40. Only 4 people knew your route for the following night. One of those 4 made an outside call from this phone. The call lasted 1 minute and 19 seconds. She said a name. Maren didn't recognize it, but she recognized the way Rufus pressed his lips together when he heard it. "Are you certain?" August asked. "Certain." "Where is he now?" "Warehouse number 2. Since this afternoon." August remained still for the length of 3 breaths. He looked at the printed page. Then he spoke in exactly the same voice he had used to thank Maren 5 minutes earlier. No louder, no colder, with nothing in it at all. Take care of it. That was all. He didn't ask why the man had sold the information. He didn't ask whether the man had a family. There wasn't a single second of hesitation between the question and the order. Teddy nodded and left. Rufus followed. The door closed, leaving only the sound of the clock on the wall. Maren stood beside the small table, still holding the box of gauze, and realized that her hands were trembling. She set the box down before she dropped it. Maren, I need to step outside for a moment. She went to the back porch, where Rufus had been unwinding the rope the day before, and leaned against the wooden railing. Wind swept in from the bay, cold and salty. She looked down at her hands beneath the light spilling from the window. They were trembling. It was the same kind of trembling she had felt that morning in the orange plastic chair, the kind that came afterward rather than before, when the body was finally permitted to understand what had just happened. For 10 years, those two hands had done only one thing. They had performed chest compressions. They had stopped bleeding. They had guided needles through human skin and tied the wounds closed. And 30 minutes earlier, they had placed a bandage over the abdomen of a man who had just ordered a life to be ended in the very same voice he had used to thank her. She remained there for a long time. She didn't cry. She simply stood until her hands stopped shaking, because waiting for something to pass was the only way she knew how to endure it. When she went back inside, Whitcomb was leaving the room with his worn leather bag in hand, and he paused in the doorway to speak to August. The wound in your side is closing well. The thigh is healing more slowly. I'll come by Friday evening to remove the stitches, around 8 o'clock. Don't walk too much before then. He nodded to Maren as he passed, his third nod. Then he went downstairs, and the sound of his footsteps gradually faded into the silence of the house. The following night, she went out to the porch again, and this time he came downstairs to find her. She heard him before she saw him, the uneven rhythm of his footsteps, one foot landing more lightly than the other. And when she turned, she found him gripping the doorframe, wearing a shirt with several buttons left undone, beads of sweat across his forehead from the 18 steps he had just descended. Whitcomb told you not to walk around, she said. He tells me many things. August straightened and released the doorframe. Come with me. He didn't apologize for the night before. He didn't say anything like she couldn't understand, or that he had been forced to do it, or that the man had deserved what happened. He simply walked ahead of her, slowly, along the ground floor hallway, while she followed with both hands tucked into the pockets of a borrowed coat. The study stood at the end of the corridor, behind a thick wooden door. Inside was a large desk, and 3 walls lined with books she suspected no one had ever read. He slid aside the painting of the sea hanging on the southern wall. Behind it was a safe door reaching as high as his chest. He turned the combination dial, and Maren looked away out of instinctive courtesy. You don't need to turn away, he said. I'm changing the combination after tonight, not because of you. The door opened. There was no money inside, no gold, nothing resembling what people saw in movies. There was only paper. He removed the files one at a time and placed them on the desk, doing it in a deliberate order, like a man taking objects from his own home to show someone else rather than a man making a confession. 2 sets of financial records, one for filing and one for actual use. A list of names beside amounts of money and dates, 3 pages long, including the names of 2 harbor inspectors and 1 person Maren was certain she had seen on the local news. Manifests for shipments that had passed through Pier 4 over the past 2 years, with numbers in the final column that she didn't understand but understood weren't legal. Contracts belonging to 4 shell companies. And finally, a craft envelope filled with photographs. He placed the envelope on the desk, but didn't open it. This contains what has happened to my people over the past 7 years, he said, and some of what my people have done to others. You can open it or leave it closed. I wouldn't recommend opening it. Maren opened it. She went through every photograph. She studied each one with the same expression she wore when a patient was transferred into her care at 4 o'clock in the morning, without blinking, without looking away. And when she finished, she placed them back in their original order. There were 3 photographs she had to study longer than the others. She didn't ask him about those 3. Why are you showing me this? She said. So you know whose house you're living in. Aren't you afraid I'll take this outside? Yes. He leaned one hip against the edge of the desk because standing for so long had begun to hurt. But you'll leave here in a few weeks, and if you leave without knowing these things, you'll create another version of me inside your mind. Perhaps a better one, perhaps a worse one. I don't want you remembering a man who never existed. He looked down at the desk, covered in papers. "Last night, you stood outside on that porch for 2 hours. I thought you would leave this morning. You didn't. I need to know why you're staying, and you need to know what you're staying with." Marin stood looking at the desk for a long time. The ledgers, the list of names, the craft envelope. Then she spoke. "I have 3 conditions. Say them." "First, I stay until you've completely healed. The wound in your thigh will need 4 to 6 weeks, and I'll know when it's finished healing. When it is, I leave, and you don't keep me here with an iron gate." He nodded. "Agreed." "Second, I don't abandon my profession. I'm going back to St. Bridget. I don't want to hear anyone tell me it's dangerous, or that I should take some time away, or that you'll provide for me. I've worked night shifts and supported myself for 10 years, and I'll continue doing it." "Agreed." "Third." She paused. This was the most difficult condition to speak aloud, and she had spent the 2 hours on the porch the night before, arranging the words inside her mind. "I don't become someone else. I won't learn how to stop seeing the things inside that envelope. I won't become accustomed to what happened last night. If there ever comes a day when I hear you give an order like that, and my hands no longer tremble, then I leave that very day, whether you've healed or not." The room fell silent. Outside, the tide was receding, and the sound of the water seemed very far away. August watched her longer than all the other times he had looked at her combined. Then he pushed himself upright from the edge of the desk, placing his full weight on the injured leg without allowing his face to tighten. "Agreed," he said. "And if that day ever comes, I'll open the gate for you myself." He began returning the papers to the safe. Marin picked up the craft envelope and handed it to him, and their fingers touched for perhaps half a second against the thick paper. Neither of them said anything about it. On the 11th day, he managed to walk downstairs without holding onto the wall, and that evening he came out to sit with her on the porch. Priscilla brought them 2 cups of tea, then went back inside. The tide was rising. Far across the water, the lights of a cargo ship moved slowly southward, and they both watched it for a while without speaking. "Do you have a family?" he asked. "No. Never had one, or don't have one anymore?" Marin held the cup of tea in both hands. She had known for days that this question would come, and she had told herself she would answer briefly, yet she heard her own voice begin to tell the story. "I had a younger sister, Junie. She was 4 years younger than me." She spoke the name aloud for the first time in a very long while, and it felt strange in her mouth. "My mother died when I was 9. They placed both of us in a foster home in Pawtucket. I was moved away twice, and both times I caused enough trouble that they had to send me back because she was still there." She took a sip. "She studied accounting. She was much smarter than I was. She worked for a small shipping company at the Port of Providence, counting cargo, keeping records, arguing with ship owners over the phone. She used to call me at midnight to tell me about numbers that didn't match. I'd be working. I'd hear 3 sentences, and then I'd have to hang up." She set the cup on the railing. "On the night of October 17th, 4 years ago, I was working the night shift at St. Bridget. At 11:45, dispatch told us a critical trauma patient was being transferred in. A traffic accident on Route 138, female, around 25 years old, no identification. We prepared the room. I stood at the entrance waiting, the way I always did. Wind swept across the porch. She didn't stop. The ambulance backed in. They opened the rear doors. I was the first person to put my hands on the stretcher, because that was my job. The person at the entrance supports the head of the stretcher and reads the vital signs. I bent down to read the monitoring tag, and I saw her face. She fell silent for the length of 3 breaths. They tell you that in a situation like that, you're supposed to step away and let someone else take over. There's an official rule for it. The head nurse that night grabbed my shoulder and repeated that rule to me. I told her to let go. I pushed the stretcher into room 3. I read the numbers, started an intravenous line, performed chest compressions, and followed every single step for 40 minutes. I didn't make one mistake, do you understand? I've gone through that night in my head at least 1,000 times over the past 4 years, and I haven't found a single step I did wrong. Her voice didn't break. It only grew quieter. At 12:27, the physician on duty called the time of death. My hands were still resting on her chest. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They said it was a hit and run, she continued. A truck. They never found the driver. The case was closed after 11 months. Every year on that date, I drive along that stretch of road after my shift. I don't leave flowers. I don't get out of the car. I only drive past and keep going. That's why I was on Route 138 that night. I wasn't lost. She turned to look at him. So don't ask me why I saved you. I didn't save you because you deserved it. I didn't know who you were. I saved you because I couldn't bear to have one more person die beneath my hands. August sat perfectly still. Then he said slowly, "My older brother's name was Wilder. He was 6 years older than me. He was the one who had been chosen, not me. I was studying far from home. I intended to do something else with my life." He turned the cup slowly between his hands. 7 years ago, he went to a meeting alone because he trusted someone. I told him not to go. I warned him once and then let it go because he was older than me, and I wasn't accustomed to arguing with him. He paused. 4 days later, they left him outside the gate of this house. Priscilla was the one who opened the gate at 5 o'clock in the morning. She was 61 years old, and I don't think she has slept through an entire night since that day. He finished the tea, though it had already gone cold. I took his chair 3 weeks later, not because I wanted it, because if I hadn't, there would have been 9 more funerals within a month, and 8 of those people had worked for this family since I was a boy. He looked toward the bay. You lost your younger sister. I lost my older brother. The difference is that you tried to save your sister with your own hands, while I warned my brother once and then stopped. Don't do that, Marin said. Don't compare them. I'm not comparing them. I'm only telling you that I understand. She nodded. Then she spoke because it was the only thing left unsaid. October 17th, 4 years ago. If you know anything about that night, about that road, then She didn't finish. August didn't answer. He didn't say there was nothing. He didn't say he would look into it. He said nothing at all, and the silence lasted too long. Far longer than the silence of someone trying to remember. Long enough that Marin turned her head and looked at him. He was staring down at the empty cup in his hands, and his face had changed. Not in the way a person's face changed when feeling sorrow for someone else. It changed in the way a person's face changed when they had been forced to make a decision very quickly and had just finished making it. It's late, he said. You should get some sleep. He stood, braced one hand against the railing, and walked back inside. Marilyn remained alone on the porch with the 2 cups, and for the first time since the night on Route 138, a chill went down her spine because of a man rather than a gun. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she was still lying awake, staring at the ceiling, and at last she got up, put on her coat, and went downstairs to the kitchen. The light was on. Priscilla sat at the head of the long wooden table with a cup of tea and a household ledger, and she didn't seem surprised to see her. "Can't sleep?" she said. "Sit down. There's still hot water." Marin sat in the same place where she had sat during the interrogation on her first day. Priscilla poured her a cup of tea. In this house, she was the only person who had never looked at Marin as though she were a problem that needed to be handled, and Marin knew perfectly well that she was about to take advantage of that, and she did it anyway. "Priscilla," she said, "may I ask you something?" "Go ahead." She opened her left hand. The 3 words written in ballpoint ink had faded but were still legible. She had traced over them once. "Have you ever heard the name of this company?" Priscilla looked down. She didn't answer immediately, the way Rufus had. She read the words, truly read them, then raised her eyes to Marin and spoke slowly. "Where did you get this name?" "From my sister's accident report." "Ah." She set down her cup. "Have you asked August about it?" "I mentioned October 17th to him tonight." He didn't say anything. He stood up and went inside. Priscilla was silent for a moment. Then she said, her voice still warm and slow, "He didn't say anything because he's afraid you'll go looking for that company alone. He thinks you'll be dead within 3 days. Rufus argued with him about it for an entire morning, so don't be too hard on him." Marin stopped with the cup halfway to her mouth. She lowered it without drinking. She sat perfectly still as something very cold inside her mind slid into its proper place. "What did you just say?" "I said not to be too hard on him." "No." Marin's voice was very quiet. "You said Rufus argued with him for an entire morning." Priscilla said nothing. "I never told you that. I wasn't there. I didn't even know an argument had happened." She looked directly into the face of the woman sitting across from her. "All I told you was that he became silent when I mentioned a date. But you know what Rufus found. You know August was afraid I would die within 3 days. You even know the exact number, 3 days." Priscilla looked down at her tea. She reached out and turned the cup 1/4 of the way around on the wooden table, very carefully, as though placing the handle in the proper direction were the most important thing left in the world. Then she released it. She didn't deny anything. That chilled Maren more than everything else. An innocent person would have questioned her, become confused, insisted that she had misunderstood. Priscilla merely straightened her back and released a long breath, the breath of someone finally setting down something she had carried for far too long. 7 years, she said. Do you know how long 7 years can be? Priscilla, Wilder was my son. Maren couldn't speak. I gave birth to him when I was 23. My brother and his wife adopted him and put their names on his birth certificate, and I came to live in this house as my own son's aunt. People did things that way back then. He never knew. I cooked for him for 29 years, and he called me aunt. She spoke evenly, without tears. Then they left him outside the gate. I was the one who opened it. Do you know what I've thought every time I carried a tray of tea upstairs during the past 7 years? She looked up. August warned him once, and then stopped. Once, and 3 weeks later, he sat in my son's chair. You believed he let his brother die. I've believed it for 7 years, she said. Mr. Orlick approached me 4.5 years ago. He told me the things I was already prepared to hear. People can only deceive us when we already want to believe them. Do you understand? Maren shot to her feet. The chair fell backward. What did you tell him? The routes, several times. The schedules. On the night of October 16th, I gave him the telephone numbers of the 4 people who knew the route, so he could choose one of them to blame. She closed her eyes. The man who was taken to warehouse number 2 the night before last. He didn't do anything. The refrigerator was the only sound left in the kitchen. And tonight, Maren said. What did you do tonight? Priscilla opened her eyes, and for the first time, her face broke apart. Tonight, I heard you telling August about your sister on the porch, she said. I was standing behind the kitchen door with the tray. I heard everything, and I realized that Orlick had done exactly the same thing to your sister, in exactly the same way, a vehicle waiting on an empty road. And I understood that if he could do that to a 24-year-old accountant, then 7 years ago he was more than capable of doing the same thing to my son, without August having to do anything at all. She stood, both hands trembling violently. I understood at 9:30 tonight. I opened the marina gate at 9 o'clock. Maren looked up at the clock on the kitchen wall. 2:17 in the morning. I tried calling him back, Priscilla said. 3 times. No one answered anymore. And outside, behind the house, somewhere near the water, a sleeping seabird suddenly burst from the rocks and released a sharp cry into the darkness. Maren ran. She didn't say another word to the woman standing beside the kitchen table, trembling. She simply turned and sprinted into the hallway, shouting Rufus's name, shouting Teddy's name, shouting so loudly that her voice broke on the 3rd call. Lights came on at the far end of the house. Feet pounded across the wooden floor upstairs. She raced up the staircase 2 steps at a time, barefoot against the cold wood, and had made it halfway down the 2nd-floor hallway toward August's room when a figure stepped out from around the corner and blocked her path. He stood a head and a half taller than she did. He was soaked from head to toe, seawater streaming onto the floor, and he said nothing. He only reached out, clamped one hand over her mouth, and drove her against the wall. His hand smelled sharply of salt and machine oil. Maren didn't struggle. That was the one thing she did right, and she did it from professional instinct rather than survival instinct. Struggling wasted strength, and she had no strength to spare. What she had was 10 years of looking inside the human body. She remained still for the length of 1 heartbeat, long enough for him to shift his weight forward, then raised 2 fingers and drove them hard into the soft hollow directly above his breastbone, the place where she had positioned her hand thousands of times to find the proper point for chest compressions. He choked. The hand covering her mouth loosened by 1/2 inch. She didn't stop. She drove the heel of her other palm into the outside of his thigh, just below the hip, exactly where the nerve ran close to the bone, the point anyone who had ever struck their hip against the edge of a table knew, except she knew precisely where it was, and she threw the full weight of her body into it. His leg buckled. Not because of pain, because for 2 seconds, that leg simply stopped obeying him. 2 seconds were enough. She slipped free of his arm and ran. She ran in the wrong direction. The door to August's room was now behind her, but a second man was coming up from the main staircase. So she turned into the narrow service stairway leading down to the marina, the stone steps Priscilla used when she collected seawater for the plants. Her foot slipped on the fourth step. Rain had begun at some point. The stone was wet, and she fell. She tumbled down the remaining 4 steps, and her right shoulder struck the stone wall with a sound she heard from inside her own body, a dry, tearing pop, and her right arm immediately became useless, dislocated. She knew it at once. She lay on her side on the wet stone, gasping for breath, and above her came the first gunshot, then the second and third, very close together, echoing from inside the house and spreading down toward the marina. Someone was running across the wooden dock. Someone shouted in a language she didn't understand. Marin dragged herself behind the base of the staircase, holding her right arm against her body with her left hand, and tried to think. Rain struck her face. Out on the marina, beneath the yellow lights swaying from their posts, she saw figures running back and forth between stacks of plastic crates piled as high as a person's chest. Then she heard Teddy calling her name. Cole. The woman came running, bent low, seized the collar of Marin's shirt with her left hand, and hauled her upright. Get up. Now. My shoulder. We'll deal with it later. Teddy dragged her across the open space between the foot of the stairs and the nearest stack of crates, a distance of about 7 steps. On the 5th step, Teddy jerked violently. She didn't cry out. She only shoved Marin down behind the crates, fell over her, then rolled aside and sat with her back against the plastic containers, one hand pressed to her left side. Marin pushed herself upright with one hand. Let me see. It's nothing. Move your hand. Teddy moved it. Marin looked for 3 seconds beneath the wavering yellow light, then did what she had done all her life. She pulled off her coat with one hand, caught the edge of the fabric between her teeth, tore away a strip, folded it into a thick square pad, placed it over the bleeding wound, and pressed down. Put your hand here, she said. Press hard. Harder. I know how. No, you're pressing lightly because it hurts. Press until it hurts. She wrapped the remaining strip of cloth around Teddy's body, threaded it beneath her back, and tied it tight, doing all of it with only her left hand, while her right arm hung uselessly at her side, forcing her to use one knee to hold the end of the fabric in place. Rain poured over both of them. Lie on this side, injured side down. Why? Because the healthy lung needs room to breathe. Teddy obeyed, and rolled onto her wounded side. Blood still seeped through the fabric, but more slowly now. The woman turned her head and looked at Marin, her face deathly pale beneath the rain, and spoke through clenched teeth. I pointed a gun at your face. I remember, and you're still doing this. I'm doing my job, Marin said, both hands still pressing down. Stay still, count with me. 1, 2. And at the far end of the marina, somewhere between the stacks of cargo crates and the curtain of rain, someone called August's name. He came down to the marina on the very legs Whitcomb had warned him not to use too much. Marin saw him before he saw her, his figure moving between 2 rows of cargo crates beneath the rain, not running, not crouching, one hand pressed to his side and the other holding a gun loosely at his thigh, and she shouted at him to get down. He heard her. He turned toward her voice, and because he turned, he saw what she couldn't see, the shadow of a man circling around from the far end of the dock, moving slowly, without haste, a man around 50, wearing a long coat, soaked through by the rain. His right arm raised level. August crossed 3 steps very quickly, seized Marin by the shoulder of her coat, and shoved her down behind an iron mooring post, covering her body with his own, and the gunshot came at the same moment his weight fell across her. She heard it, not with her ears. She felt the impact pass through his chest and into hers, the way a body moved when something entered it, and the 10 years of medical training inside her recognized it before her conscious mind could give it a name. He slid down beside her with his back against the mooring post. Look at me, she said. She was already on her knees. Her left hand had slipped beneath his shirt and found the wound in his abdomen, higher than the old scar, and she pressed her entire palm over it and leaned all her weight down. He didn't cry out. He never cried out. Get down, he said. Be quiet. Footsteps were approaching across the wet wood. From where she crouched, Marin saw a pair of shoes stop about 4 steps from the mooring post. Then the man stepped out of the darkness, and she saw his face for the first time in her life. An entirely ordinary, tired face, the kind belonging to a middle-aged man attending a school meeting for his grandchild. He looked at August. Then he looked at Marin, and his gaze passed over her as though she were nothing more than something placed beneath the leg of an uneven table. He said something brief in his own language, and raised the gun one final time. The shot came from the one direction no one on that marina was watching. It came from the far end of the dock, from the walkway leading back toward the house, the same path only one person had used every Friday evening during the past 7 weeks. Yevgeny Orlik staggered half a step to the side, then collapsed onto the wet boards and didn't rise again. Marin turned her head. Abel Whitcomb stood beneath the dock light, his silver hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, the worn leather bag still hanging from his left shoulder. In his right hand was a handgun she had never seen him carry. He stood perfectly straight. Then he lowered his arm, and Marin saw the dark stain spreading across his coat, just above the waist, and she understood that he had already been shot, perhaps somewhere along the walkway, perhaps several minutes earlier, and that he had crossed the entire distance to reach the end of the dock. He fell to his knees first, then settled fully onto the wet boards with his back against a post. His left hand still gripped the strap of the bag. Marin called August's name, called Rufus, called anyone, and someone came running, and someone else took over the pressure her hand was holding against August's abdomen so she could pull away. She crawled toward the old man. "Let me see. Don't waste your time." His voice was still as dry as ever, as though he were reading a line from a medical chart. "Go back to him. Move your hand." He moved it, and she looked, and she had been an emergency room nurse for 10 years, so she knew within 2 seconds, and he saw her face, so he knew that she knew. "Yes," he said. "Why are you here?" "Friday evening, 8 o'clock. I already told him." He tried to draw a breath. "I came to remove the stitches." Rain continued to fall. Behind them, people were shouting for a doctor, calling for a vehicle, calling to one another in confusion. "Everyone has suspected you for 7 weeks, Marin said. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. "I know. Nash had someone following me from the 2nd week." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Orlik came to me 4 years ago. Offered money, then offered more. I didn't take it. That made me the only person in this house he couldn't buy. And if I had spoken about it, he would have known I had told them, and he would have found someone else." He breathed out. "So I stayed silent. What are 7 weeks? Let them suspect me." His hand tightened around the leather strap. "There are hemostatic forceps in the bag. The outer compartment. Take them and use them on him." Marin didn't move. "Go," Whitcomb said. "You still have someone over there." And she went because it was the only thing he wanted and the only thing she could still do. Dragging the leather bag beside her as she crawled back toward the mooring post, her knees scraped raw against the wet boards, her right arm still hanging uselessly at her side. Behind her, the old man remained seated against the post while rain fell over both hands he had finally released. When she reached the mooring post, Rufus was the one holding pressure against August's abdomen, and she told him to move aside. She placed both hands over the wound, her left hand over her right even though she could barely feel her right arm, and leaned the full weight of her body down. Rain poured over the back of her neck. August had grown far paler than he had been 3 minutes earlier. "Look at me," she said. "Look into my eyes. Don't look anywhere else." He opened his eyes. "Breathe with me. In. Count 1, 2. Out. Count 1, 2, 3. Slowly. You're breathing too fast." He tried. His first breath fell out of rhythm. Then he found hers. "Good. Again." He looked at her and started to say something, and she knew exactly what kind of sentence it was, because she had heard hundreds of people begin sentences like that on the emergency room floor at 4 o'clock in the morning. "No," she said. "You aren't allowed to say that. Whatever you want to tell me, you can tell me tomorrow. Right now, your only job is to breathe." Her voice wasn't gentle. It was the voice she used to tell a 64-year-old man not to fall asleep, the commanding voice, flat and hard, leaving no room for argument. "Listen carefully. I've already watched someone slip away beneath my hands. Once in a lifetime is enough. You aren't allowed to do that to me a second time. Do you understand? Breathe." And he breathed. They carried him back to the house on the same old board from the van. Rufus called 2 other physicians from the city, and both arrived within 40 minutes. The study at the end of the hallway became the room where they spread their cloths and set up their lights, the room where the painting of the sea concealed the safe. They told Marin to wait outside. She argued. Rufus quietly told her that her shoulder was dislocated, that she couldn't lift a tray, that she had already been on her feet for 4 hours. She looked down at her right arm and knew he was right, and for the first time in 10 years, she had to stand on the other side of the door. The hallway was long and cold. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, and she couldn't clearly remember when someone put her shoulder back into place. Teddy came over with one arm wrapped across her ribs, white bandages visible beneath the edge of her shirt, and sat beside her without asking. The woman didn't speak for 4 hours. She only sat there, and whenever Maren could no longer hold herself together and began to tremble, Teddy reached over with her uninjured hand, gripped Maren's wrist, and held it tightly without saying a word. At around 5 o'clock in the morning, the door opened, and one of the 2 physicians stepped out, removing his gloves. He said the bullet had entered the luckiest place it could possibly have entered, that they had repaired the damage, that August would survive if infection didn't set in, and that this time he truly had to remain still. Maren nodded. Then she bent forward and cried for the first time in 7 weeks, very briefly, perhaps 10 seconds, both hands covering her face. Teddy turned her head and looked away for her. Dawn rose over the bay close to 6 o'clock, gray at first, then pale pink, while the retreating tide left a dark band of mud along the rocky shore. August woke after the sun had fully risen. Maren was sitting in the chair beside the bed when she saw his hand move. "You're here," he said. "Don't talk too much." "I have to." He turned his head toward her. "Junie Cole." Maren became still. The truck that night was registered to a transportation company in Fall River. That company belonged to Orlick. Your sister submitted a whistleblower report to the state tax department on October 14th, 3 days before she died. Rufus discovered it on the morning of your second day in this house. He said it all in one breath, then had to stop and rest. "I ordered them not to tell you." Rufus argued with me. I still refused to change my decision. "I kept it from you for 7 weeks. The room was very quiet. Seabirds cried outside. "Why?" she asked. "Because I was afraid you would go after him alone and die. That was the reason I gave myself." He looked up at the ceiling. "But there was another reason I never admitted, not even to Rufus. If you knew, you would understand that you had been sitting in this house, eating with these people, changing my bandages, while the man who killed your sister was still walking free outside, and I was afraid of the day you would look at me and realize that I was also part of the world that took her from you." He was silent for a moment. "I took 7 weeks from you, 7 weeks when you deserved to know. I'm not asking you to forgive me because I know forgiveness for something like that can't be requested." Maren remained silent for a very long time. She thought of the cold iron gate beneath her palm on that early morning. She thought of Teddy asking whether anyone was waiting for her beyond it. She thought of Priscilla turning her teacup 1/4 of the way around on the wooden table, of the old man sitting against the post with his hands finally released, and of the 7 weeks that had just passed, all 7 of them at once. Then she spoke. "You were wrong. You were terribly wrong, and I'll remain angry with you for a long time, perhaps a very long time." She drew in a breath. "But I already told you in the study. I won't become someone else. A person like me doesn't walk away while her patient is still lying there." She pulled her chair closer. "I'm staying, but I'm staying on my terms. Tell me, next Monday, I'm returning to St. Bridget. The night shift, exactly as before. I'm not changing my hours, I'm not changing departments, and I'm not letting anyone drive me there or bring me home." She looked directly at him. "As for you, I'm not asking you to become a good man overnight. I don't believe in that, and I don't want to hear you promise it. I'm asking only one question. That safe in the study. Can it become thinner within 2 years?" He looked at her for a long time. "It can't be emptied completely, Yepon. I won't lie to you about that. There are things I could remove that would get people killed, and not Orlick's people. Then remove whatever can be removed. That can be done." He nodded slowly, gradually, one thing at a time. "I can't promise when it will be finished because I don't know. I don't need to know when it will be finished. I need to know which direction it's moving." "It will move in that direction," he said. Then he raised his hand slowly, searched for hers, and placed it over the left side of his chest, beneath the shirt and the layers of bandages. "Count," he said. Maren left her hand there and counted out of 10 years of habit, never taking her eyes from the clock on the wall. Beat. Beat. Even. Slow. Strong. The same rhythm she had found beneath 2 fingers on that rainy night beside Route 138. when she had reached through the shattered window of a burning car without knowing who the man inside was. That Monday, Maren Cole returned to the night shift at St. Brigid. She had to keep her right shoulder in a sling for another 2 weeks, and she told everyone she had fallen down a staircase. No one asked further questions. Close to 9 o'clock that evening, a little girl around 6 years old was brought in after falling from her bicycle in a nearby neighborhood. One knee was badly scraped, and her mother followed behind, far more frightened than the child. Maren washed the abrasion, gently blew it dry, then covered it with a blue bandage printed with tiny fish. The little girl bent down and studied it for a long time, then looked up with a smile and said it was beautiful, much prettier than the bandages they had at home. Maren told her that if she kept it dry, she would be running and playing again in 2 days. The child jumped down from the bed and ran toward her mother, and her laughter remained in the hallway for a while after the door had closed behind them. Some losses never heal completely, and we shouldn't lie to ourselves by pretending they will. But we have the right to choose what we do with them, to choose to let them become the reason we save someone else, rather than the reason we stop living. No one deserves to be judged only by the place where they were born, or by the family they never had the power to choose. And sometimes, what a person needs isn't to be forgiven immediately, but simply to have someone remain beside them long enough for them to believe they might still be worth staying for. If Maren and August's story touched your heart, please leave a like to let us know you stayed with us until the very end. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories every day. How do you feel about Maren's choice, what she held on to, and what she finally let go? We would love to read your thoughts in the comments below, wishing you and your loved ones peace, health, and happiness. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.